The chains bit into Ellery Finch's wrists as two Viren guards shoved her through the tunnel mouth, and the light of the Verity ring hit her like a wall. 40,000 throats were already roaring. Somewhere above the stands, drone cameras swung to track her, feeding the span to every annex system in the Cordon Imperium, and Ellery did not flinch from any of it. She had learned in 6 years of captivity that flinching only fed them. Blood Marshal Ilyara Vex watched the Deathworlder cross the sand from the shaded dueling box reserved for the Trial Corps unbroken champions, and felt the familiar warm pulse behind her throat fronds. The flare that came before every duel gold shading toward orange, pride lighting her up from the inside like a struck match. 41 duels. 41 kills. No Viren in 3 centuries had carried an unbroken line so far into the Trial Corps record, and today's opponent was nothing, a scrawny human girl in her 16th cycle, arms roped with the kind of lean muscle that came from hauling ore crates, not from training. "She looks half-starved," said Chief Overseer Mordrash Kell from the box beside her, not troubling to lower his voice. Mordrash ran span propaganda for the Trial Corps, and he liked his broadcasts to open with a joke. "Try not to end it too fast, Blood Marshal. The province's like a show." Ilyara didn't answer. She was already rising, already letting her ceremonial blade whip uncoil from its wrist spool with a sound like a snake tasting the air, already stepping down into the sand, where the ring's announcer drone hovered to broadcast her voice across 400 systems. "Deathworlder," Ilyara said, and let the word carry the contempt she felt for it, soft, wet, prey word, the word Virens used for a species that had clawed its way up out of gravity and radiation and violence too crude to be called anything but animal. "You have the Imperium's mercy. Kneel now and live as labor, or stand and die honestly, the way your kind seems to prefer." The crowd loved it. Ilyara heard the laughter roll up through the tears, heard Mordrash's satisfied hum through the box audio feed. Every duel opened this way, the offer, the insult wrapped inside the offer, the girl's inevitable, useless defiance, and then the clean kill that reminded every subject world watching that resistance to the Cordon Imperium was a child's tantrum against a hurricane. Ellery Finch did not kneel. She rolled her shoulders once, working the ache the chains had left, and looked at Ilyara with an expression that had nothing performed in it at all, no fear dressed up as bravado, no bravado dressed up as fear. Just a flat, terrible patience, the look of someone who had done arithmetic on this exact moment for longer than the crowd wanted to imagine. "Your mercy killed my father," Ellery said. Her voice didn't carry the way Ilyara's did. No announcer drone amplified a captive's words. That was never part of the show, but Ilyara heard it anyway, low and even. "I'm not interested in the rest of it." The guards released her wrist chains and stepped back through the sally gate. The horn sounded, a long bronze note that rolled off the tiered stone and out through the ring's open dome toward the ships waiting in orbit to relay the feed further out, past the Cordon homeworld, into the deep provinces where 600 billion citizens tuned in for exactly this. The reassurance that the universe still made sense, that the strong still governed the weak, that a blood marshal's blade whip would always find a Deathworlder's throat before the girl had taken 3 steps. Ilyara took her opening stride, blade whip already singing out in the wide showman's arc that always made the crowd gasp, aimed to crack across Ellery's collarbone and drop her to her knees for the finishing strike. The arc she had thrown flawlessly 41 times. Ellery didn't retreat from it, and she didn't try to dodge it clean. She stepped inside it. She closed the distance in half a second, inside the whip's killing radius before the coil had even reached its full extension, and Ilyara's whole body registered the wrongness of it a half-beat too late. Virens didn't close range. Virens danced at range. That was the whole architecture of the duel, spacing and feint, and the long, elegant geometry of the blade whip's reach. And then the girl's shoulder drove into her sternum like a dropped stanchion, and the world tipped sideways. 1. Ilyara's own momentum betrayed her. She'd committed her whole weight into the strike, and there was nothing left to brace with. Ellery's hand closed around her whip wrist. Not a graceful hold, nothing like the formal grips taught in the trial corps academies, just a crushing human grip that found the exact tendon that mattered and bent it the wrong direction. 2. Something in Ilyara's wrist gave with a sound she felt more than heard, a white flash of pain up through her elbow, and her fingers sprang open on reflex, and the blade whip fell hissing into the sand. 40,000 voices that had been roaring went suddenly, collectively quiet, the silence spreading up through the tears like water finding its level. 3. Ellery didn't let go of the wrist. She used it, a lever, a fulcrum, her whole compact weight rotating through Ilyara's own broken balance and through her. 4. Ilyara hit the sand on her back hard enough to empty her lungs, hard enough that the throat fronds she had felt flaring gold-orange with pride a heartbeat earlier went white, then a pale, sick blue. The color Virans went only in true shock, a color the span cameras caught in brutal, unforgiving close-up and beamed to 600 billion citizens in real time. 5. Ellery Finch was standing over her with Ilyara's own fallen blade whip's fighting knife. The sidearm every duelist carried and never needed, because no captive had ever gotten close enough to take it, held an inch above Ilyara's throat, and the whole ring was silent enough that Ilyara could hear her own pulse hammering and Ellery's steady, unhurried breathing above her. Nobody moved. Not the guards, frozen at the Sally gate with weapons half raised and no order to fire on a duelist's body without command. Not Mordrash, who had risen halfway out of his seat in the box with his mouth actually open. Not the 600 billion citizens across 400 systems whose feeds had just shown them, in 5 unbroken seconds, that the thing they had been told was structurally impossible had happened in front of them, live, unedited, uncut. Ellery held the knife there for 3 full breaths. Ilyara watched her own death considered and set aside like a tool put back on a shelf. Then Ellery straightened, tossed the knife into the sand well out of both their reach, and stepped back. "I'm not like you," she said, quiet enough that only Ilyara and the nearest microphones caught it, and the words went out across the span anyway, into archives that would never be fully scrubbed no matter how hard Mordrash's people tried in the hours that followed. "I don't need to kill someone to prove what I am." The horn that should have sounded the duel's end, the horn that only ever sounded once a body hit the sand and stayed down, didn't sound at all, because there was no protocol for this, no procedure card in any trial corps binder for a blood marshal disarmed and spared by a Deathworlder in 5 seconds in front of the entire Imperium. And into that procedural silence, the guards finally surged forward to drag Ellery back toward the Sally gate. And Chief Overseer Mordrash Kell was already screaming at his technicians to cut the feed, 4 minutes and 11 seconds too late to matter. Ilyara lay on her back in the sand with her wrists screaming and her fronds burning that sick pale blue, staring up at the dome's open eye where the drones still hovered, and understood with a clarity that felt like falling, that the ring had just watched her fall, and that nothing about her life was going to be simple again. They took her to the trial corps infirmary in a transport with the windows blacked out, which told her everything about how the day was going to go from there. A physician set the wrist in a bone-knit brace and said nothing about the color of her fronds, which had not come back up out of that pale sick blue in 3 hours, the longest shock color hold Ilyara had ever experienced or heard described. Her mentor, Elder Marshal Thesech Vor, arrived an hour after that and did not sit down. 41-1, Thesech said. Her own fronds were a controlled, disappointed gray, the color of a teacher confirming a fear she'd carried a long time. You understand what that number means to the Corps actuaries, not the loss. The Corps has absorbed losses before quietly off the span. It's that the whole galaxy watched this one. "I know what I saw," Ilyara said. Her voice came out rougher than she meant it to. "I've reviewed the timing 3 times. She was inside my whip's kill radius before I'd committed a third of the arc. That isn't luck. That isn't malnutrition making a captive desperate. That's technique. Someone taught that girl to fight at a range our whole doctrine says a Deathworlder physically cannot close. It doesn't matter what it is. Thesach's fronds pulsed once sharper. It matters what 600 billion citizens think it is. And what they think right now is that the Imperium's unbroken champion was put on her back by a 16-cycle captive who then chose in front of everyone not to kill her. Do you understand what that second part does? The kill would have been a tragedy the Corps could bury under casualty statistics by morning. The mercy is a story. Stories don't bury. Ilyara said nothing. Outside the infirmary's shuttered window she could hear, faintly, the sound of the ring's outer plaza, usually empty by this hour, still full of restless noise. Citizens who had not gone home, who were standing in the dark arguing about what they'd seen. You're suspended from active duel rotation pending tribunal review, Thesach said. Effective now. There will be a review board. There will be a great many people who want you gone entirely, because you are, as of 4 hours ago, the single most inconvenient Viren in the Imperium, and inconvenient things get quietly disposed of. She paused at the door. I taught you the blade whip form myself, Ilyara. I have never in 30 cycles seen anyone close inside its arc like that. Whatever you decide to do about what happened today, decide it as if your whole record depends on understanding it correctly. Because it does. The door closed. Ilyara lay in the infirmary bed with her wrist throbbing and her fronds still refusing to climb back out of that pale, humiliated blue, and thought about the look on the girl's face when she'd said your mercy killed my father. Not rage, not the wild-eyed defiance the trial core scripts always assumed captives would perform. Just arithmetic. Just a person who had already worked out, long before she ever set foot on the sand, exactly what she was and was not willing to become. 3 levels below the ring, in a holding block that smelled of rust and recycled air, Ellery Finch sat against the cold wall of her cell with her knees drawn up, and let her hands finally start shaking, now that no one with a camera could see it. You're bleeding, said the boy in the cell across the corridor bars. Corwin Yates was 14, a colony orphan the trial corps had swept up in the same tithe raid that took Ellery, small enough that the guards mostly forgot he existed, which had kept him alive this long. Your lip. From the throw, probably you bit it. I'm fine. Ellery touched her mouth and it came away red, and she wiped it on her sleeve without much interest. Did you see it, all of it? They ran it on the block feed, until the Overseer's people killed the signal. Everyone saw it. Corwin's voice had an edge in it she hadn't heard from him before, something that wasn't quite hope, because hope was dangerous down here but was standing close enough to it to feel the heat. Ellery, you beat a blood marshal in 5 seconds, and then you let her live. I didn't let her live because I'm generous. Ellery leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. Her father's voice was in her head, the way it always was in the worst moments. The drills he'd run her through in the root cellar under their homestead back on Anvil Reach before the Imperium ships came down and turned 6 years of her life into this. Distance is the lie they'll believe about you. Close it before they finish believing it. I let her live because if I'd killed her, I'd have been exactly the animal they already think I am. And because dead, she's a martyr the Corps can use. Alive, disgraced, in front of everyone, she's a problem they can't clean up quietly. That's worth more. Corwin was quiet a moment. You planned that on the sand in 5 seconds. I've had 6 years to plan it, Ellery said. The 5 seconds were just when I finally got to use it. Corwin shifted against the bars, pulling his knees up the way she had. 6 years. You've been in trial corps custody the whole time. Labor tithe for 2. Ring pens for 4. Once a floor supervisor decided I hit back too hard during a ration dispute, and the record needed a category for that. Ellery examined the drying blood on her sleeve without much interest. My father ran a militia scout post on Anvil Reach before the sweep. He used to say the Imperium's whole doctrine was built on nobody ever testing it properly. Duelists train against duelists. Garrison troops train against garrison troops. Nobody on this side of the galaxy has ever had to fight something that grew up under real gravity, with predators bigger than a transport shuttle. He drilled me in the root cellar every night after the evening tithe count, grip, leverage. How to read a stance before the person attached to it knows they've committed to it. He said it wouldn't matter unless someday it had to. And then it had to. And then it had to. Ellery's voice didn't change, but something in her jaw tightened. He didn't get to see it work. I keep thinking about that. 6 years of drills for a 5-second fight he never got to watch. Corwin was quiet for a moment, turning something over. My mother used to hide extra ration chits in the lining of my coat before the sweeps came through our sector. Said if I ever got separated from her, I'd need something to trade. I still have the coat. I don't have her. He said it plainly, without asking for anything back, and Ellery understood that plainness for what it was, the same arithmetic she'd learned herself. Grief filed down until it could be carried without cutting the hands that held it. "You're not separated from anyone now," Ellery said. "You're stuck with me instead. I realize that's not the same as family." "It's not nothing," Corwin said. "No," Ellery agreed. "It's not nothing." She looked down at her hands, at the knuckles already bruising along the ridge where they'd met Ilyara's wrist. "I used to think the only thing I was saving myself for was one clean shot at whoever they put in front of me. Standing on that sand, I understood it was never going to be that simple. Every duelist they send out is somebody's 41, same as she was mine. Killing my way through the core one duelist at a time was never going to be a plan. It was just going to be one more thing they could point a camera at and call proof we're animals." She shook her head slowly. Letting her live was the only version of tonight that actually cost the Imperium something. The block door clanged open at the far end and 2 guards came down the row, stopping at Ellery's cell. She stood before they could reach for her, chin level, and let them cuff her wrists again without struggle. There was a time to close distance and a time to conserve strength, and her father had taught her that arithmetic too. "Overseer wants you," one of the guards said, not unkindly, which was itself strange enough that Ellery filed it away. "Alive and unmarked." Those are his exact words, alive and unmarked. They walked her up through 3 checkpoints to a chamber she hadn't seen before. All polished stone and spanned monitor banks glowing along one wall, each screen showing some fragment of the last 6 hours. News feeds from a dozen systems, unrest reports scrolling in Viren script too fast to read, a looping 5-second clip that the core-owned sensors had failed to fully suppress, playing over and over on a monitor nobody had bothered to mute. Ellery closing the distance, Ilyara's blade whip falling, the throw, the knife raised and then lowered. Chief Overseer Mordrash Kell stood in front of the monitors with his back to her, watching his own disaster replay itself in 8-screen multiplicity. "Do you know how many systems have seen that clip today?" he said without turning around. 211. "Do you know how many of those systems already had unrest quotas flagged before this morning? 140. You didn't just embarrass a duelist, girl. You handed 140 restless provinces a symbol." He turned, and his fronds were a dark, controlled violet, the color of a Viren holding rage on a very short leash. "I could have you executed within the hour and call it a processing accident. No one would ask a second question." "Then why haven't you?" Ellery said. "It wasn't quite a question." "Because a dead martyr photographs worse than a live embarrassment I can still shape." Mordrash studied her the way Ilyara had studied her in the sand, except where Ilyara's contempt had been personal, his was purely actuarial. "There will be a second Verity, a rematch. Official framing. The Blood Marshal was injured entering the ring, the duel was invalid, honor demands a clean resolution. You will lose it. Decisively, publicly, and this time there will be no ambiguity for the provinces to build a story out of." His fronds pulsed once. "The Corps has methods for making sure a rematch goes the way it needs to go. You will not be given the chance to close distance twice." Ellery said nothing. She had learned in 6 years that silence in front of men like Mordrash cost nothing and gave away nothing, and that was worth more than any answer she could give him. "Take her back," Mordrash told the guards. "Feed her properly this time. I need her strong enough to lose convincingly, not so weak it looks staged." He was already turning back to the monitors, back to the 5-second clip still looping in its corner, as if watching it enough times might finally change what happened in it. "And someone get me the Blood Marshal's tribunal date moved up. If she's going back in that ring, I want her back in it before the provinces have time to decide they liked what they saw." On a mining relay 3 jumps coreward, a Vekar tithe collector watched the 5-second clip for the 9th time on a cracked public terminal in a transit hall crowded with off-shift laborers, and said nothing to the 2 colleagues flanking her, because saying anything out loud in a transit hall carried its own tithe. But she watched the girl step inside the Ark a 9th time, and a 10th, and something in the quiet, methodical way the crowd around the terminal kept replaying it, over and over, without comment, told her the silence itself had started to mean something the Imperium's monitors hadn't yet found a way to flag. On a border world called Desaz Hollow, where a cordant garrison had put down an actual uprising 4 cycles earlier with considerably less restraint than the doctored Anvil Reach record had ever pretended to use, a group of off-duty dockworkers ran the clip on a loop through an entire night shift, until a junior officer finally ordered the terminal seized. And by then, 11 separate copies had already propagated through the relay's local mesh network. Each one a little more degraded than the last, none of them fully recoverable, none of them ever fully gone. Mordrash Kell's own weekly Unrest Digest, the internal one, the one that never went out on the span, logged 43 new flagged incidents across provincial systems in the 6 days following the first Verity, more than double the prior month's total, and every flagged incident summary line referenced, in one phrasing or another, the same 5 seconds. On a shipping corridor world called Pharaoh's Drift, 3 annexation cycles into Cordon administration, and still bitter about the Ortithe renegotiation that had followed it. A woman named Kesh Bardu ran a legitimate dock cooperative by day, and by night, something considerably less legitimate. A loose network of couriers who moved information the span wasn't supposed to carry, information that mostly amounted to shipping delays and quietly adjusted tithe quotas nobody upstream wanted advertised. Kesh had been doing this kind of work for 6 cycles without once putting anything in writing that could be traced back to her, and she watched the 5-second clip the same night everyone else on Pharaoh's Drift did, alone in the cooperative's back office with the terminal volume turned low, and did not immediately understand why her hands were shaking. It took her most of the night to work out why. It wasn't the fight itself. Kesh had seen violence, had seen worse violence than a disarming throw and a knife set down unused. It was the 5 seconds after the throw, the part where nothing happened, where a girl who could have ended a blood marshal's life in front of the entire Imperium had chosen instead to make the Imperium watch her choose not to. Kesh had spent 6 cycles telling herself that the most useful thing she could do for Pharaoh's Drift was stay quiet and stay careful, move information without ever becoming the story herself, and watching Ellery Finch stand over Ilyara Vex with a blade raised and lowered undid something in that calculation that Kesh hadn't realized was load-bearing until it gave way. By the end of the week she had stopped being careful about one specific thing. She began attaching a single unedited frame from the clip, the moment of the throw, nothing else, nothing that could be called incitement under any cordant statute she'd read, to every shipping manifest her couriers carried between Pharaoh's Drift and the 4 neighboring systems on her usual routes, tucked into the metadata where a board custom scanner would never look twice. It was a small thing. It cost her almost nothing in risk. It reached, within 11 days, more systems than the Trial Corps' own official span feed had ever bothered broadcasting a duel to. because Kesh's manifests went places the core propaganda office had never thought worth covering. Mining relays and border garrisons and colony administrative offices that existed mostly to process tithe paperwork, and had no reason to expect a girl's 5 seconds folded into their supply chain. Mordrash Kel's Unrest Digest never once mentioned her by name. Kesh Bardu never rose high enough on anyone's threat assessment to earn a line item of her own. But the 43 flagged incidences Digest recorded in the first 6 days became 61 by the 2-week mark, and a disproportionate number of them traced back, when a junior analyst finally bothered to look closely enough, to shipping corridors that all touched at some point. A small cooperative dock on Pharaoh's Drift that nobody in the trial corps had ever had reason to watch. The crackdown, when it came, landed somewhere else entirely. On Dissaz Hollow, the garrison that had already seized one set of copied terminals moved a second time, faster and harder, sweeping an entire dock shift roster into detention on a blanket unrest suppression order that didn't bother distinguishing between the workers who'd actually run the clip and the ones who'd simply been standing near a terminal when it played. 41 dock workers were processed under the order. The number would have meant nothing to the garrison captain who signed it, and meant everything to the handful of people on Dissaz Hollow who'd already started keeping track of which numbers kept recurring. And the sweep, rather than ending the problem, produced exactly the kind of martyr story Mordrash had told Ellery herself, in his own office, that a live embarrassment could still be managed, and a dead one could not. Not every reaction ran in Ellery's favor. On the cordon homeworld itself, in the high administrative districts where trial core duels were watched less as spectacle than as reassurance, a block of senior magistrates filed a formal complaint with the tribunal, arguing that a captive's public defiance, left unanswered, risked normalizing resistance across every annex system at once, and that whatever had happened in the ring, the response needed to be decisive, public, and final. It was that complaint, more than any private grudge, that gave Mordrash Kell the political cover he needed to push a second, harsher clause through a tribunal calendar that would otherwise have taken months to clear. 3 days after Mordrash's monitors had chewed through their 211 system tally, a new floor supervisor was rotated onto Ellery's block, a broad-shouldered Viren named Asen, who didn't shout the way the others did, who moved through the cells with a clipboard and a quiet, careful attention that Ellery clocked as wrong within the first hour. "Extra ration today," Asen said, sliding a tray through the slot in her door with 2 portions instead of the usual one, a slice of dense gray protein cake sitting beside the standard gruel. "Overseer's orders. Says you need the strength back before the second verity." Ellery didn't touch it. She had learned in 6 years that kindness with no visible source cost something somewhere, and Mordrash Kell was not a man who spent resources on a captive's comfort. She waited until Asen moved on down the row, then passed the tray, untouched, through the gap at the base of the bars to the block's rat, a thin gray scavenger that had been living in the block's drainage great longer than Ellery had been a prisoner in it, and that ate anything a human would. The rat was dead within the hour, curled small and still beside the grate, and Ellery sat with her back against the wall and did not feel triumphant about being right. "They tried to poison you," Corwin said, low from across the corridor, his face pale in the dim block light. "Before the verity, before the crowds." Quietly, "They tried to poison me because a quiet death here doesn't need 600 billion witnesses." Ellery kept her voice level, the way her father had taught her to keep it level even when the arithmetic came out ugly. "If I die of processing complications, in a cell 3 days before the rematch, Mordrash gets a clean story and no second ring full of cameras to worry about. It's smarter than what he tried on the sand. I should have expected it sooner." She didn't eat anything from the block kitchens for the next 2 days, trading what she could spare of her single ration for sealed nutrient bars, a sympathetic dock worker, the same one who'd once slipped her father's old militia patch past an inspection, back before the sweep, A debt Ellery had never had the chance to properly repay. Managed to pass through a guard, willing to look elsewhere for the price of a favor owed from before the annexation. It was not enough food, and by the third day her hands had the faint, familiar tremor of a body running on less than it needed, and she said nothing about it to anyone, because saying it would have meant admitting how close Mordrash had actually come. On the second morning of Ellery's hunger strike against the block kitchen's food, 2 guards came for Corwin instead of her, dragging him out of his cell by the collar of his donated coat, while he twisted to keep his eyes on Ellery the whole way down the corridor. And Ellery understood, watching it happen, that Mordrash's actuarial mind had simply moved to the next line item once the first one failed. "Where are you taking him?" she said, and heard her own voice slip out of the flat register she'd spent 6 years building, heard it crack half a degree towards something that sounded, to her own ear, dangerously close to fear. "Reassignment," the lead guard said, not meeting her eyes. "Overseer's orders." They kept him 3 hours. Ellery spent all 3 of them sitting against the cold wall of her cell, doing the only thing she knew how to do with time she couldn't spend on anything useful, which was arithmetic. How many guards on the corridor? How far to the checkpoint? How much good any of it would actually do her chained inside a cell with a door she couldn't open from her side, and arriving each time at the same answer? None. She had nothing to trade and nowhere to move, and a boy who'd hidden nothing from her about who he had left in the universe, which was nobody, which meant whatever Mordrash did to him would cost the Imperium nothing it valued and would cost her everything. They brought Corwin back a little after the 3 hours, unmarked, Mordrash's exact phrasing again, alive and unmarked, the same promise he'd made about Ellery herself before the second verity, and hearing it second-hand told her precisely how deliberate the choice of words had been, and put him back in his cell across the corridor without explanation, and it was a long while before he spoke. "They didn't touch me," he said finally, in a voice gone very small. "They just showed me things. A processing manifest. My name already logged on it, next transport out, unskilled labor tier. A moon I've never heard of with an atmosphere rating that isn't rated for anything under 18 cycles without a suit. They said it was a scheduling formality. Routine." He wrapped his arms around his knees. "Then a man came in, not a guard, better dressed, and told me to make sure I mentioned it to you, casually, like I was doing you a favor by warning you." Ellery sat very still. "That was the message, not the manifest, you telling me about it." "I figured that out about halfway through," Corwin said. "I'm sorry, I couldn't tell if not telling you would have been worse." "It wouldn't have been." Ellery closed her eyes. "He wants me to know he can reach you without touching me at all. That's cleaner than poison. Poison, he has to explain if anyone asks questions later. A transport manifest for an unskilled colony orphan going to a moon nobody's ever heard of. Nobody asks questions about that." "Ever?" She opened her eyes and looked at him steadily through the bars, and made herself say the next part plainly, because plainness was the only kindness she had left to offer him. "He's telling me the second verity isn't the only leverage he's got left. If I do anything in that ring he doesn't want, if I win too cleanly, or lose too obviously staged, or say one word out of place the way I did the first time, that manifest stops being a threat and starts being a shipping schedule. So what do? We don't do anything yet. We wait, and we watch which guards start looking at you a little too carefully, because that's how I'll know he's decided to stop bluffing." Ellery's jaw was tight, but her voice held the same level arithmetic calm it always did, because the alternative was letting Corwin see exactly how much the threat had landed, and that wasn't a cost she was willing to make him carry. "And you keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Nothing that gives anyone downstairs a reason to write your name on a different kind of manifest." Corwin was quiet a long moment. "You could tell the Blood Marshal when she comes back." "I will," Ellery said. "But I'm not going to lean on that being enough, because the last time I leaned on someone else's mercy being enough, It cost my father his life on a supply dispute technicality nobody bothered to double-check. I'm not doing that again. Not with you." She let her head fall back against the wall, eyes on the ceiling, and did the arithmetic one more time, the same arithmetic, arriving at the same answer, filing it away next to all the others. "I just need it to hold a little longer than he thinks it will." When Ilyara visited the block 4 days later, she noticed anyway the leaner set of Ellery's face, the new stillness in a girl who had already been unnervingly still, and asked about it directly, the way she seemed to ask most things now, without the diplomatic padding trial corps officers usually wrapped around a question to a captive. "Someone tried to make sure I didn't survive to the rematch," Ellery told her, and watched Ilyara's fronds cycle through a fast, ugly sequence of colors before settling into that controlled violet Ellery was starting to recognize as Viren rage held on a leash. "I stopped eating what the block kitchen sends. It's slower this way, but slower is survivable." Ilyara didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "I'll have my own supply line run to this block by tonight. Sealed, tested, outside Mordrash's chain." Her voice had gone flat and precise, a duelist's voice assessing a threat rather than a blood marshal's voice delivering a verdict. He is running out of subtle methods faster than he realizes. That should tell you something about how frightened he actually is. "It tells me I need to survive 2 more weeks instead of 1 clean afternoon in the ring," Ellery said. "I'd rather have the odds of the ring. At least there I get to see it coming." Ilyara did not sleep that night, and the wrist brace ached whenever she moved her hand, and both of those facts were easier to sit with than the third one, which was that she had spent 6 hours combing through the ring's raw, unedited footage from every camera angle the Corps owned, over and over, looking for the moment where the girl had gotten lucky, and had not found it once. There was no luck in it. Ellery Finch had watched Ilyara's stance in the seconds before the horn. Ilyara could see it now, replaying frame by frame, the girl's eyes tracking the weight distribution in her hips, reading the coming arc before Ilyara herself had fully committed to it. That wasn't animal desperation. That was a trained eye reading an opponent's tell, the exact discipline the trial corps academies spent a decade teaching duelists to recognize in each other, and to never expect from a captive. Someone had trained that girl. Ilyara pulled the public captive intake record for Ellery Finch. Thin, 3 lines, colonial tithe sweep, anvil reach, processed for labor after a resistance incident, and found it maddeningly incomplete in the specific way records got incomplete when someone with clearance above a duelist had gone through and trimmed them. She used her blood marshal's residual archive access, the last privilege the tribunal hadn't yet stripped, to pull the annexation logs for Anvil Reach instead. It took 4 requests and 2 forged justification codes before the file opened, and when it did, Ilyara sat very still in the dark of her quarters and read it twice to be sure she wasn't misunderstanding the cordon administrative Viren. The official record, the one that had gone out to every subject system at the time, said Anvil Reach had staged an armed uprising against its Imperium garrison and been pacified according to standard doctrine. The annexation log, the internal one, the one with casualty tallies and unit movement orders instead of a story for the provinces, told a different sequence. There had been no uprising. A garrison commander named Vresk Dalane had falsified a resistance flag to justify a punitive sweep after a supply dispute, and the sweep had killed 41 colonists, including a militia scout listed as Desmond Finch, in order to make an example that would keep the rest of the colonies or tithe flowing on schedule. 41, the same number as Ilyara's unbroken record, and she felt the coincidence land in her chest like a second, quieter blow. Ellery Finch had not lied to her in the ring. "Your mercy killed my father" had not been a captive's dramatic flourish. It had been a plain, arithmetically precise statement of fact, and Ilyara had stood over it wearing the Imperium's ceremonial blade whip, and calling the girl an animal for refusing to kneel to the same institution that murdered her father to keep a tithe quota intact. She sat with that until the false dawn of the station's cycle lights came up, and then she did something she had never once done in 9 cycles of trial core service. She went, unannounced, to visit a captive in the holding block. The guards on duty didn't stop a blood marshal, even a suspended one, and Ellery was awake when Ilyara's shadow fell across the cell bars, sitting against the wall with her knees drawn up exactly as she had been the night before. "Come to finish it properly," Ellery said, not afraid. Flat, the same arithmetic voice from the sand. "I read your colony's annexation record," Ilyara said. She hadn't planned the words. They came out before she decided to let them. The real one, not the one the span ran. Something shifted behind Ellery's eyes, not surprise exactly, but a wariness sharpening into focus. The look of someone recalculating an opponent mid-conversation the way she'd recalculated one mid-duel. "Why?" "Because I don't understand why a captive who could have killed me chose not to, and I wanted to understand it correctly before I decided what to do about it." Ilyara's fronds, she was aware, had not fully climbed back out of pale blue in 18 hours, and she made no effort to hide it from the girl. "Mordrash is planning a second Verity. Rigged. You won't be given the chance to close distance twice." Those were his words. "I don't yet know exactly how he intends to guarantee it, but I know him well enough to know he'll guarantee it more than one way, because he doesn't trust a single point of failure." "And you're telling me this because I have spent 9 cycles believing the trial core offered something the Cordon Imperium calls mercy, and I killed 41 people believing that word meant what it said." Ilyara's voice did not shake, but it cost her something to keep it level. "I watched the footage of what your father's death actually looked like, Finch. It looked exactly like every duel I have ever won. A story built over a fact nobody wanted looked at too closely." Ellery was quiet for a long moment, studying her through the bars with the same flat patience she'd worn on the sand. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing yet." Ilyara held her uninjured hand loosely at her side, an old habit of showing empty palms in negotiation that felt suddenly, uselessly formal in this rusted corridor. "I wanted you to know someone outside that box saw the record. That's all. I don't know yet what I intend to do with it." "Then figure it out fast," Ellery said, "because Mordrash isn't waiting for you to finish deciding." Ilyara left without another word, because there was nothing else true left to say, and walked back through 3 checkpoints with her fronds still that same pale, unrecovered blue, thinking about the phrase "figure it out fast" the whole way, and about how strange it was that a chained captive had just given her an order and she had felt, for the first time in 9 cycles of trial core discipline, no instinct at all to refuse one. 2 days before the tribunal review convened, a new incident report crossed Thesach Vor's desk that had nothing to do with either duel and everything to do with the timing of both. It named Ellery Finch as the instigator of a block disturbance, a fabricated account of a captive assault on a floor guard, complete with a corroborating statement from a second guard neither Thesach nor Ilyara recognized from any prior roster, and it recommended immediate transfer to a maximum restraint holding tier pending disciplinary review, a transfer that would, as a practical matter, have kept Ellery out of any tribunal-adjacent proceeding, and out of any ring for as long as Mordrash's office wanted to extend the review. It was Asen who brought the discrepancy to Ilyara's attention, and he did it badly, nervously, the way a man does something he has already decided will end his career before he has finished deciding it is worth doing. He found her in the ring's outer corridor, ostensibly to deliver an unrelated supply requisition, and instead pressed a data chit into her hand without a word of explanation, and left before she could ask him anything. The chit held a shift log, his own, kept privately, against trial core regulation, because Asen had spent 9 cycles as a floor supervisor learning that private records were the only kind that survived an internal review intact. And the log placed him on Ellery Finch's block for the entire window. The incident report claimed the assault had occurred, and it recorded, in his own flat administrative shorthand, that nothing had happened on that block during that window beyond a captive, refusing a food tray, and a coughing fit from the cell 3 doors down. Ilyara found Asen again that evening, off shift, in a supply corridor where he clearly hoped not to be found. "You logged this knowing what it would mean if it surfaced," she said, not as an accusation. "I logged it because I've watched that girl for 11 days, and she has never once given a guard a reason to write a true incident report about her, and I am not interested in writing a false one," Asen said. His fronds had gone a tight, unhappy amber, the color of a violin doing something his whole career had trained him not to do. "I gave her a poison tray on Mordrash's order and told myself it was routine. I watched her feed it to a rat instead of eating it, and I watched that rat die, and I told myself that was routine too, because a floor supervisor who starts asking why the overseer wants a captive dead doesn't stay a floor supervisor long." He didn't look at her while he said it. "I'm done telling myself things are routine, Blood Marshal. I don't know what that makes me. I know what it makes the report." It made the report actionable, which was the only thing that mattered to Ilyara in the next several hours. She took Asen's private log and the fabricated incident report both to HFY that same night, and HFY, who had spent 9 cycles training Ilyara to treat institutional paperwork as close to sacred as anything the trial corps possessed, read both documents twice and then did something Ilyara had never once seen her do. She picked up the fabricated report, walked it to the recycler herself, and fed it through by hand. "That report never crossed my desk," HFY said, watching it go. "If Mordrash's office asks, it was misfiled. If they push harder than that, I will personally escort whichever functionary drafted it to a data integrity review, and I doubt very much they will enjoy explaining a corroborating witness who does not appear on any roster this corps has ever issued." Her fronds had settled into that same deep, controlled violet Ilyara had seen once before, the night she'd first laid the annexation logs on the table between them. "He is getting sloppy, Ilyara. Frightened men reach for tools faster than they can verify them. That is useful to us, and it will not last, so we should not waste the window it opens." The window held. Ellery Finch's incident file remained, officially, clean, and 2 days later she walked into the tribunal's public record exactly as she had walked out of her cell that morning, unmarked, undelayed, and with a floor supervisor's quiet, career-ending honesty standing, unacknowledged, somewhere behind her. The tribunal review took place 4 days later, in a chamber with 11 seated judges and no public gallery, and it did not go the way Elder Marshal HFY had warned her it might. "The footage is not in question," said the presiding judge, an old Viren administrator named Corvith Ash, whose fronds stayed a flat, unreadable gray through the entire proceeding. "The technique used against you has been analyzed by 3 separate combat instructors from the academy. All 3 conclude the same thing: the captive closed range using a grappling method that exploits joint mechanics common to most bipedal species but almost never trained against, because trial corps doctrine has, for 3 centuries, assumed Deathworlders lack the discipline to execute coordinated technique under duel conditions. That assumption has now failed publicly, and badly. The question before this tribunal is not whether you lost. It is whether you lost because you were negligent, or because the entire corps was wrong about what it was fighting." "I submit that it was the latter," Ilyara said, and heard several of the 11 judges' fronds shift color at once: surprise, distaste, in a few cases something that might have been reluctant respect. "I have reviewed the footage extensively. I made no procedural error the doctrine did not itself create. If this tribunal wishes to assign fault, I would ask it to look past me, to the assumption that told every duelist in this corps a Deathworlder could not close inside a blade whip's arc. That assumption is what actually lost the ring that day. I merely embodied it. It was not the defense Thesech had expected her to make, and Ilyara watched her mentors Franz pulse with something complicated across the chamber, pride and alarm braided together. Because Ilyara had just, in front of 11 tribunal judges, indicted the trial court's entire founding doctrine rather than simply defending her own record, and there was no path back from a statement like that. It would be repeated. It would be used by whichever faction of this tribunal wanted to use it, for or against her, and either way it could not be unsaid. A second judge, a broad, older Viren named Pharaoh Isk, whose Franz had stayed knotted in a tight, disapproving copper through the whole proceeding, leaned forward. That is a convenient philosophy for a duelist who lost. Tell this tribunal plainly, Blood Marshal, do you believe the Cordon Imperium was wrong to annex Anvil Reach? The chamber went very still. It was not the question the review had been convened to answer, and every judge on the bench seemed to understand that Isk had asked it anyway precisely, because it was the one question Ilyara couldn't answer safely in either direction. I believe, Ilyara said, choosing the words with the same deliberate care she'd once reserved for a blade whip's arc, that the annexation record the span broadcast to the provinces does not match the annexation record in this corps' own internal archive. I have read both. I am not qualified to rule on Imperium policy. I am qualified to say that a blood marshal who kills captives while trusting a record that turns out to be false is not upholding honor. She is laundering a lie through a duel. That is not an answer to my question. It is the only honest one I have, Ilyara said. I would rather this tribunal judge me for refusing to answer a question outside my competence than for pretending I have an answer I don't. Judge Ash's Franz shifted, faint and gray, something that in a less guarded Viren might have been the beginning of approval. Duly noted and duly evasive, Ash said. This tribunal will take both under advisement. She glanced down the bench at her fellow judges, a silent poll Ilyara had no way to read. Are there further questions before deliberation? There were none from the rest of the bench. Isk raised one hand before Ash could call for deliberation, and requested formally that the tribunal hear a second witness, a duelist named Kaldrek Voss, third in the corps' current active rankings, and as Ilyara had known for 6 cycles without ever needing to say it aloud, the officer who stood to inherit her rotation slot and her seniority the moment the tribunal declared her record permanently compromised. Kaldrek testified for 11 minutes, and every one of them was aimed with the precision of a duelist's own trained economy of motion. He did not attack Ilyara's account of the footage. He agreed with it, which was worse, because agreement dressed up as reasonableness carried further in a tribunal chamber than open hostility ever could. He agreed the technique was real, agreed the doctrine had a blind spot, agreed even that Ilyara's read of the failure was probably correct in the abstract. And then he pivoted gently, devastatingly, to the only question the chamber actually cared about. My colleague is right that the doctrine failed, Kaldrek said, his Franz a composed, reasonable gray that made his next words land harder than any accusation could have. But doctrine failing is not the same question as whether this corps can afford to let the blood marshal who lost to it stand in this ring again, in front of 600 billion citizens, carrying whatever she decides to say next about Imperium policy on live span feed. I have reviewed her statement to this chamber today. It is eloquent. It is also, functionally, a public indictment of annexation practice delivered by a serving trial corps officer with an unresolved loss on her record. I do not say this to attack her honor. I say it because someone on this bench needs to ask, plainly, whether reinstating her serves the corps stability or simply hands its most dangerous critic a bigger stage. It was, Ilyara understood immediately, the argument Mordrash himself couldn't safely make in a tribunal chamber without exposing his own hand, delivered instead by a rival with every incentive to make it sound like professional concern rather than ambition. She watched Pharaoh Isk's frown shift toward something almost satisfied, and understood that whatever coalition had engineered this hearing's second act, it ran wider than Mordrash Kell's office alone. "I would ask the witness a question, with the tribunal's permission," Ilyara said, and Ash, after a beat, nodded her along. "Kaldrek, if this tribunal strips my rank today, who administers the second verity Overseer Kell has already filed and had approved before this hearing even convened?" Kaldrek's composed gray flickered just once before he answered. "I would assume the Corps would assign its next available senior duelist." "Which is you," Ilyara said. "Third in current rankings, as you said yourself. So the tribunal should understand that the officer testifying about the danger of letting me keep my stage stands to inherit both my rotation slot and my rematch if that testimony succeeds." She let that sit in the chamber for exactly as long as her disarming silence had sat in the ring 7 days earlier. "I don't say that to attack his honor either. I say it because someone on this bench needs to ask plainly whether his concern serves the Corps stability or simply serves Kaldrek Voss." Judge Ash's fronds shaded, faint and gray, toward something that was unmistakably amusement this time, quickly suppressed. Isk stayed copper and hard, but he asked no further questions, and Kaldrek Voss was excused from the chamber with his composed gray, never fully recovering its earlier evenness, and the bench fell into the kind of working silence that meant the real argument would happen after Ilyara had been asked to leave the chamber. The judges deliberated for 11 minutes and returned a verdict that satisfied no one entirely. Ilyara Vex was reinstated to active trial corps rank, pending full public restoration of honor through a sanctioned second verity, per Overseer Kell's petition, which the tribunal noted had already been filed and approved before the review even convened. Ilyara understood, walking out of that chamber, that she had just been handed exactly the outcome Mordrash wanted, dressed up in language that made it look like a tribunal's independent judgment instead of a foregone conclusion, and that the only question left was what she intended to do once she was standing on that sand again, with a captive's life balanced on her next choice. She found the answer 3 days later, going through duty rosters she had no formal authorization to read, when she discovered that the second verity had been quietly restructured from a single duel into a reinforced honor trial. Ilyara would open it, and if the outcome proved uncertain within the first exchange, 2 additional trial corps duelists stationed in the tunnel would enter the ring under emergency doctrine to assist. A provision technically legal under a 3-century-old clause, never once invoked because no duel had ever needed it. It was not a duel anymore. It was an execution with a duel's costume draped over it, and Ilyara's name was going to be the one history recorded standing over the body. She went to Thesech that night, in the Mentor's private quarters, and laid the roster and the clause and the annexation logs on the table between them without preamble. "You know what this is," Ilyara said. Thesech read through all of it in silence, her fronds shading slowly from neutral gray to something darker, closer to the deep violet of controlled anger Ilyara had rarely seen her wear. "I know what it looks like," Thesech said finally. "I would prefer to believe it is something else, because if it is what it looks like, it means Mordrash has weaponized a 3-century-old honor clause to murder a 16-cycle captive in front of the entire Imperium, using my own former student as the blade and calling it justice. That is exactly what it is." "Then what do you intend to do, Ilyara? You cannot refuse the verity. Refusal is treason under the tribunal's own reinstatement terms. You'd be executed before the girl. You cannot win it honestly and spare her again. Mordrash has built a second layer specifically to prevent that outcome from ever repeating." Thesech's voice had an edge Ilyara had never heard from her, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, the sound of a teacher watching a student walk toward a cliff with no visible way around it. There is no clean path through this. I know, Ilyara said. So I'm going to make it public before it's clean, and let 600 billion citizens decide whether they want to keep watching. The night before the second Verity, Asen, still nominally the block's floor supervisor, though Ilyara suspected his tenure in that post now had a very short remaining clock on it either way, brought Ellery her evening ration personally instead of routing it through a junior guard, and used the moment to pass along, quietly, the thing he'd overheard 2 levels up that he judged she needed to know before she walked onto the sand. The transport manifest, he said, not looking at Corwin's cell across the corridor, keeping his voice pitched for Ellery alone. It's been moved up. Departs the morning after the Verity, regardless of outcome, unless Overseer Kell personally rescinds the order before then. He set the tray through the slot with more care than the gesture required. I'm telling you because I don't think anyone else is going to, and because I've decided I'd rather be the kind of supervisor who gets dismissed for it than the kind who doesn't. Ellery absorbed that the way she absorbed everything now, without visible reaction, filing it into the same arithmetic that had carried her through 6 years of worse news delivered worse. So whatever happens in that ring tomorrow, the boy ships out the next morning unless Mordrash personally decides otherwise. That's my read of it, yes. Which means it was never really about how I fight tomorrow, Ellery said slowly, working it through out loud for the first time. He set the manifest date before he could possibly know how the Verity ends. It's not a reward for losing convincingly. It's a threat that fires regardless, unless I give him something else worth calling it off for. She looked at Asen through the bars, and something in her flat expression sharpened into a question. She didn't quite know how to ask a man who'd already risked more for her than she'd expected any Viren to risk. Why are you telling me this instead of just letting it happen? You don't owe either of us anything. I fed a captive poison because a man in a nicer uniform told me it was routine, Asen said. I've had 11 days to sit with what that makes me. I'm not going to fix it by doing nothing tomorrow too. He straightened, resuming the flat professional posture of a man delivering a standard ration, because a guard down the corridor had come into view. Fight well, Finch. Whatever else happens, fight well. She turned the information over the whole night, lying on the thin cell mattress with her eyes open in the dark, and by the time the guards came for her at dawn, she had done what she always did with a piece of arithmetic that refused to resolve cleanly. She had set it aside, not because it stopped mattering, but because carrying it onto the sand with her would cost her exactly the half-second of hesitation Mordrash's contingency duelists were counting on her not to have. She said nothing about it to Ilyara when they met at the tunnel mouth before the horn. There wasn't time, and there was a version of this fight where telling her would only give Ilyara one more thing to protect at the cost of the thing that actually needed protecting, which was both of them staying alive long enough for it to matter at all. But she carried it anyway, the way she'd carried every other piece of arithmetic that had ever mattered, filed where it could sharpen her instead of slow her down, and stepped out into the ring's light already 3 moves ahead of whatever Mordrash thought his manifest was going to cost her. The second Verity opened 7 days later, and this time the ring was fuller than Ilyara had ever seen it, every tier packed, every drone camera slot along the dome rented out to feeds from systems that had never bothered broadcasting a trial core duel before, because this time the whole Imperium already knew what had happened the first time, and wanted to see whether the story would repeat or correct itself. Somewhere in a private box high above the sand, Ilyara had been told, sat a relay screen carrying a live feed to the Cordant capital itself, where the Sovereign's own household was, for reasons no one below Mordrash's rank had been told, watching this one directly. Ellery Finch came out of the tunnel steadier than she had 7 days earlier, properly fed, as Mordrash had ordered, and moving with the same flat, arithmetic calm, though Ilyara, watching from the dueling box before her own entrance, saw the girl's eyes flick once briefly, toward the second tunnel mouth on the ring's far side, the one that hadn't been opened during the first verity, and understood that Ellery had already guessed, or been warned, or simply calculated, that this fight had a second layer built into it too. Ilyara descended to the sand with her wrist fully healed and her blade whip re-spooled, and did not open with the mockery this time. She let the announcer drone catch her silence instead, let it stretch a full 4 seconds longer than protocol called for, long enough that the crowd's roar thinned into confused murmuring, long enough that Mordrash in the box could be seen through the drone's wide angle leaning forward with his fronds sharpening toward Violet. 7 days ago, Ilyara said, and her voice went out across the span to 600 billion citizens and to a relay screen in the Cordant capital. This captive defeated me in 5 seconds using a technique 3 centuries of trial core doctrine insisted was impossible. I told the tribunal that review found me innocent, that the doctrine was the true failure, not my technique. The tribunal agreed publicly on record. What the tribunal was not told is that today's duel is not a duel. Mordrash was on his feet in the box now, gesturing furiously at a technician, but the feed cut order hadn't reached the relay drones fast enough, and Ilyara kept talking into the 4 extra seconds she'd bought herself with silence. Under a clause invoked once in 3 centuries, 2 additional duelists are staged in the North Tunnel to enter if I fail to secure a kill quickly. This is not honor. This is Chief Overseer Mordrash Kell arranging the murder of a 16-cycle captive, because her survival embarrassed him in front of the provinces, and dressing it in a ceremony so that history remembers it as justice. The ring had gone entirely silent, the same silence that had followed Ellery's 5 seconds 7 days earlier, but wider now, heavier, 600 billion citizens holding a breath they didn't know they were holding. And into that silence the North Tunnel gate ground open anyway, because Mordrash's contingency didn't care what had just been said aloud, only that its trigger condition, a duel not yet ended in a kill, had been met. And 2 trial core duelists came out onto the sand, with weapons already drawn. "Behind me," Ilyara said low to Ellery, and the girl didn't argue, didn't hesitate, simply pivoted so her back met Ilyara's, and the 2 of them stood spine to spine on the sand the way no Viren and no captive had ever stood in the Verity Ring's 300-year history, facing outward at 2 duelists who had walked into this expecting an unarmed execution and found instead a fight. The first duelist came at Ellery fast, testing the same distance closing technique that had beaten Ilyara, clearly briefed on the footage, expecting her to try it again, and Ellery didn't. She let him commit to a wide, cautious spacing arc meant to deny her the close-in grapple, and the moment his weight settled into that stance, she simply stepped inside a different angle than the one everyone had studied, drove her palm into his elbow joint hard enough to buckle it, and used his own overextended reach to pull him past her and into the sand face first, exactly the throw her father had drilled into her 100 times in a root cellar 6 years and 1 execution ago. The second came at Ilyara's blind side, and she felt Ellery's shoulder blades shift against her own a half second before the strike landed, a wordless warning passed spine to spine, and pivoted just in time to catch the duelist's blade whip on her own re-spooled coil instead of her throat. She answered with the arc she had thrown 41 times before and once, 7 days ago, had lost. Except this time her opponent hadn't watched Ellery Finch's footage as closely as he'd watched Ilyara's old record, and the arc landed clean, dropping him hard onto the sand with his own weapon skittering away. The whole exchange took less time than Ellery's original 5 seconds against Ilyara had. When it was over, both fallen duelists lay disarmed on the sand, and Ilyara and Ellery stood back to back at the center of the ring, breathing hard, in a silence that lasted exactly as long as it took Mordrash Kell to decide his contingency duelists weren't going to be enough. His next move came not from the tunnel, but from the box itself. A side door at the base of the dueling box swung open, and two of his own household guards, not garrison, not trial corps, men who answered to Mordrashkel personally, and to no roster Ilyara had ever seen, dragged Corwin Yates out onto the raised platform at the box's edge, in full view of every drone camera still broadcasting, and one of them pressed a sidearm's muzzle against the boy's temple, while the other held the platform rail so the whole ring could see exactly what was being threatened. "Finch," Mordrash's voice came over the box audio, no longer performing calm, something raw and cornered in it now that hadn't been there when he'd opened the feed with his rehearsed lines about honor and ceremony. "You end this. Right now. On your knees, both of you, hands where the garrison can see them, or the boy's manifest gets amended in a way that doesn't require a transport shuttle." Ellery felt something in her chest go very still and very cold, the specific stillness she'd only ever felt once before, standing in a root cellar being told her father wasn't coming back from the supply post. And she understood, with the same flat clarity that had carried her through every other impossible arithmetic problem the Imperium had ever handed her, that Mordrash had just made the one mistake his actuarial mind should have been built to avoid. He had shown 600 billion citizens, live and unedited, that the chief overseer of Span propaganda for the Trial Corps was willing to execute a 14-cycle colony orphan on a dueling platform to save face over a rematch he'd already rigged twice. "Don't," Ilyara said low at her shoulder, and Ellery realized she'd already begun to move toward the box before she'd finished deciding to. "Look at the rail he's standing behind. It's structural, not decorative. It wasn't built to hold a hostage display. It was built to keep spectators from falling into the pit during Verity ceremonies 3 centuries ago. Mordrash doesn't know that. His guards don't either." Her voice stayed level, the same duelist assessment voice she'd used describing the reinforced honor clause days earlier. "I need 4 seconds." Ellery didn't ask what for. She simply turned, the way she'd learned to turn on nothing but a shift in someone's weight, and gave Ilyara the 4 seconds by doing the only thing she had left to spend them on. She walked toward the box's base with her hands rising, slow, visible, exactly the posture of a captive surrendering. Drawing both household guards' full attention downward, toward her, instead of upward, toward the platform rail Ilyara was already climbing with the same quiet economy of motion she'd once used to close inside a blade whip's arc. It took Ilyara 2.5 of her 4 seconds to reach the rail, 1.5 more to get a hand on it, and by the time the guard holding the sidearm registered movement above and behind him instead of below, Ilyara's fist had already closed around his wrist and wrenched the weapon skyward, the shot going wide into the dome's open eye instead of into a 14-cycle boy's skull. And the second guard's grip on the platform rail was the only thing that saved him from following his colleague over it a moment later when Corwin, freed of the muzzle at his temple, drove an elbow backward into the man's ribs with a viciousness nobody watching would ever have guessed a colony orphan half his captor's mass could produce. The ring's silence broke into something between a gasp and a roar, 600 billion citizens processing, in real time, a chief propaganda officer who had just ordered a child's execution on live Span feed and lost, and it was into that fresh, ragged silence, the crowd's noise not yet fully returned, the platform guards disarmed and face down, Corwin shaking but upright at Ilyara's side, that Mordrash's voice cracked out over the box audio one final time, ordering the garrison guards stationed at the ring's perimeter to open fire on everyone still standing on the sand and the platform and call it a containment failure, and every one of the 600 billion citizens still watching heard it too, live, unedited, because nobody had managed to cut that feed in time either. The garrison guards did not fire. Ilyara watched them hesitate at the perimeter rail, weapons half raised, looking not at her, or at Ellery, or at the 2 household guards being held down by a shaking but furious 14-cycle boy, but up at the relay screen high above the dome, the one carrying the direct feed to the Cordant capital, where, For the first time since the broadcast began, something on that screen had visibly changed. A small overlay, a formal seal, the unmistakable mark of the sovereign's own household communications office, cutting into Mordrash's feed with an override authority no garrison captain in the ring was willing to ignore. "Chief Overseer Mordrash Kell," said a voice that carried through every speaker in the ring, cool and unhurried in a way that made Mordrash visibly flinch in the box. "You are relieved of span authority, effective immediately, pending full investigation into the falsified annexation record of Anvil Reach and the unauthorized invocation of the reinforced honor clause broadcast to this household not 4 minutes ago. Garrison command in the Verity Ring will stand down and secure the chief overseer for tribunal transport." It took the garrison captain a visible 3 seconds to decide whose authority outranked whose in that moment, and then he moved, and 4 guards converged on the box instead of the sand, and Mordrash Kell's protests dissolved into the same helpless silence that had swallowed the crowd twice now in 7 days. Ilyara sat down on the sand where she stood all at once, the adrenaline leaving her legs in a rush, and Ellery lowered herself down beside her a moment later, and for a long stretch neither of them said anything at all while the ring around them slowly filled back up with a different kind of noise. Not the roar of a crowd watching an execution, but something more ragged and uncertain. Thousands of people trying to decide, in real time, what to feel about what they'd just watched. "You could have let the first one hit me," Ellery said eventually, quiet enough that it stayed between them. "Instead of covering my blind side, you didn't owe me that." "You didn't owe me the knife you set down 7 days ago," Ilyara said. Her fronds, she realized without needing to check a mirror, had finally climbed back up out of that pale sick blue for the first time in 11 days, not to the proud gold-orange of before, but to something steadier, a color she didn't have a name for yet because no Viren duelist had ever needed one. "I've been doing arithmetic of my own since then." It took another 6 days for the tribunal to finish its investigation, and by the end of it Mordrash Kell was in a holding cell of his own, charged with falsifying a colonial casualty record and unauthorized use of an honor clause in the commission of what the formal charge sheet, remarkably, called attempted extrajudicial execution. Language no trial court document had ever used about a captive before, because until 11 days ago, captives had not been considered the kind of thing that could be extrajudicially executed. The second Verity's footage, and Ilyara's testimony alongside it, had done that much at least. It had forced the word onto a page where it could not easily be scrubbed off again. Asen's private shift log became, in the days after the second Verity, considerably more than a floor supervisor's quiet act of conscience. HFY entered it into the formal tribunal record herself, unprompted, as corroborating evidence of a pattern of extrajudicial pressure against a captive prior to a sanctioned proceeding, and the resulting inquiry cost Asen his post, exactly as he'd predicted it would, but replaced it 11 days later with a transfer to the newly formed Doctrinal Review Office. HFY had been authorized to staff. A considerable promotion dressed, on paper, as a lateral reassignment, because the Corps had learned enough in the last 2 weeks to know better than to advertise which of its own people it was rewarding for honesty. Kaldric Voss did not fare as well. His testimony before the tribunal, replayed alongside Ilyara's cross-examination in the same clipped archival footage that had already made the annexation record impossible to fully suppress, made him, within a matter of days, a minor and unflattering footnote to a story the provinces were far more interested in than his career ambitions. And when the second Verity's own footage reached the span 2 hours after the sovereign's household had lifted whatever suppression order Mordrash's office had once held over it, showing exactly whose rotation slot he'd stood to inherit and exactly how he'd have inherited it, the Corps Internal Advancement Board quietly closed the file on his promotion for the current cycle and did not reopen it. Pharaoh Isk kept his seat on the tribunal bench, unrepentant and copper-fronded to the end of the proceeding, but found himself, in the cycles that followed, consistently outvoted by a bench that had watched Judge Ash's dry, unreadable gray prove the more reliable read of where 600 billion citizens' patience was actually running. On Pharaoh's drift, Kesh Bardu never learned that a blood marshal's tribunal testimony had cited, in general and uncredited terms, a marked increase in unregistered information traffic through several mid-corridor systems, as evidence that public confidence in the official span feed had already begun eroding before the second Verity ever aired. She simply kept running her cooperative, kept tucking single unedited frames into shipping metadata long after the second Verity gave her considerably more footage to choose from, and told herself, when she thought about it at all, that she'd only ever done something small. The doctrinal review HFY was authorized to convene took the better part of 2 cycles to produce even a preliminary finding, because 140 cycles of institutional doctrine did not unmake itself on any faster a timetable than it had taken to build, and Ilyara sat on its founding panel not as its chief architect. That title went, formally, to HFY, but as its most cited case study, her own 41 duels and the technique that had ended them analyzed, reared, and eventually folded into a revised academy curriculum that taught every incoming cadet, for the first time in 3 centuries, to train against a Deathworlder's full plausible range, rather than the doctrine's comfortable assumption of its absence. The Anvil Reach annexation record took longer still. Garrison Commander Vresk Dalling, the officer who had falsified the resistance flag that killed 41 colonists including Desmond Finch, was located 8 cycles later commanding a border garrison 2 systems over, still drawing full cordant pay and pension credit, and the file the tribunal's investigators built against him, cross-referenced against 6 other punitive sweeps his signature appeared on across a decade of service, each one dressed in the same tidy fiction of an uprising that had never occurred, took the better part of a year to work through a cordant military tribunal that had never before been asked to prosecute one of its own for manufacturing the pretext of a rebellion rather than merely suppressing one. Ellery Finch was not present for any of it. She had asked once, through a data relay message routed to Ilyara's residual archive access, to be told only when it was finished, not while it was happening, because she had already spent 6 years living inside her father's death and did not intend to spend the next several reliving it one tribunal hearing at a time. The Sovereign's household issued a formal suspension of the Trial Corps captive duel program pending a full doctrinal review, which was not the same as ending it. Ilyara understood politics well enough to know a suspension could quietly become permanent or could just as quietly expire in 2 cycles once the provinces stopped watching so closely. But it was more than had existed 12 days earlier, and HFY, reviewing the suspension order with her fronds settled into a rare, unguarded shade of pale gold, told her it was the first structural change to Trial Corps doctrine in 140 cycles. Ellery Finch was released from the holding block on the 14th day, not as a labor-branded captive, and not as a free citizen of the Imperium. The cordant bureaucracy had no clean category for what she'd become, and in the absence of one, Ilyara had spent 3 days arguing across 2 departments to have her registered under Trial Corps protective custody, a designation with almost no legal precedent, and, crucially, no expiration clause anyone had thought to write. They stood together at a transport bay on the edge of the ring complex, Corwin Yates a few steps off with a duffel of donated belongings that amounted to everything he owned, waiting on a shuttle that would take the 2 of them to a relocation processing center, and eventually, to whatever came after that. Ilyara had not yet worked out the shape of it, only that it would not be a return to Anvil Reach. Not with the annexation record still under active investigation, and the colony itself still nominally under cordant administration. "You're not coming with us," Ellery said. It wasn't quite a question either. "I'm reinstated," Ilyara said. Full rank, full record 41-2 officially, if anyone bothers counting the second verity as a loss, which I intend to insist they do. The Corps needs someone inside it who remembers exactly what its doctrine costs when nobody's watching the span feed closely enough. That's a duty I can't do it from a relocation shuttle. So we probably won't see each other again. I didn't say that. Ilyara's fronds shifted, faint amusement threading through the steady color they'd settled into. I have residual archive access. I intend to keep tracking Anvil Reach's status very closely, and I have a growing professional interest in tracking the career of a 16-cycle Deathworlder who closed a Blade Whip's kill radius in half a second and then chose, twice, not to use the wind the way everyone expected her to. I imagine our paths will cross again. Ellery held out her hand, an old Earth gesture Ilyara had seen exactly once before. In an anthropological briefing she'd slept through as a cadet, and had never expected to need. And Ilyara took it, human style, wrist to wrist instead of the formal Viren forearm clasp, and held it a moment longer than the gesture strictly required. 600 billion people watched you fall, Ellery said. And then they watched you get back up and stand somewhere you weren't supposed to be standing. That's a harder thing to do than winning a duel in 5 seconds. I know, because I only had to do the second one. The shuttle's boarding chime sounded, and Corwin called Ellery's name from the ramp, and she let go of Ilyara's hand and walked toward it without looking back, not out of coldness but because Ilyara understood now, watching her go. Ellery Finch had never once in this whole ordeal wasted emotion on anything that wasn't load-bearing, not a glance, not a word, not a single step that didn't carry weight toward where she was actually going. Ilyara stood on the transport bay's cold platform until the shuttle cleared the atmosphere, and then she turned back toward the ring, toward the tribunal offices where 140 cycles of doctrine were, for the first time, genuinely up for revision, and let her fronds settle into that new, steady, unnamed color the whole walk back. Not pride, not shock, not the gold orange she'd worn for 9 cycles believing an unbroken record was the only thing worth being. Something quieter than that, something that had needed in the end exactly 5 seconds and one held knife to teach her the difference.